Star Trek the Motion Picture, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, Star Trek V The Final Frontier, and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country. And Star Trek Generations, Star Trek First Contact, Star Trek Insurrection, and finally Star Trek Nemesis. Oh, but then just Star Trek again, then Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond. But that's it, for now. It's everyone's second favourite film series with Star in the title, stemming from a little TV show from the late 60s that one could describe as, low budget. Now, if you're one of the cool girls at school who doesn't know anything about that stupid Star Trek show, I'll give you a brief history of the franchise. In 1967, Gene Roddenberry created the original Star Trek series. The one with Kirk and Spock and Tribbles and everything. It was great. It was fine. For what it was actually very high quality. In 1969, the studio decided to cancel it, because it looked like it had stopped drawing a fan base. You know, just like all those other shows that were cancelled because nobody liked them. 10 years later, they released the first Star Trek movie. Because, you know, that was just the most relevant time to do that. Then came several sequels, and by the late 80s, Star Trek had gotten popular enough to warrant a reboot TV series. Basically a sequel to the original show. But they still decided to crank out a couple more movies based off the original show while they had started making the new show. Then after The Next Generation was over and done with, and halfway through the third Star Trek series, they started making movies based on Next Gen. While this second slate of Star Trek movies was underway, 2 more Star Trek shows came out. 4 or so years after Star Trek Enterprise was done and nobody liked Star Trek anymore, they decided to reboot the entire franchise from scratch by going back to a prequel-ish retelling of the original series as a film series. And now a new Star Trek show is getting off the ground, which will tell a different story in the Star Trek universe each season, kind of like a series-long anthology show, jumping back and forth between being a prequel, a sequel, a midquel, paraquel, all while the reboot films continue cranking out sequels over and over again until our grandchildren are long dead. Now, if for whatever reason this is confusing for you, I've drawn a very simple diagram here. But I want to talk about the movies, not the shows, and all of them from start to finish, to analyse the evolution the series has had. So get ready, because like a lice comb, I shall go through the child's scalp that is this series, being very thorough while at the same time somewhat irritating. Let's go! When I was 11, I had to have my tonsils taken out. I was a bit nervous, since it was the first actual surgical procedure I'd ever had, even though it was a minor one. But one thing I was curious about was how fast it takes sleeping gas to take effect on you. To which I learned you really only need to be breathing that stuff in for like 5 seconds until you feel more tired than you've ever had in your life. More tired than if you've spent 8 hours running a marathon uphill or pushing a wheelbarrow full of cinder blocks. Star Trek the Motion Picture is so slow and so boring. Sleeping gas in a hospital would feel as energizing as a centipede enema. It represents one of the biggest misfires made by Hollywood producers ever. At least 2 years after the first Star Wars movie, which, I'll remind you, is a fast-paced action-adventure film that everyone in the world loved, the makers of the first Star Trek movie decided not to copy the pace and tone of that recently released box office powerhouse, but instead styled it on 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie as old as the original Star Trek show, and that a lot of people find so slow that it's nearly unwatchable. Good job guys, knowing your market there. Now, this pretty starscape I've been talking over to give the impression that this video isn't a horribly slapped together mess is the movie's overture. It's classy, yeah, but it's sinister in its simplicity because what it's doing is subtly letting you know what you're in for. Space for ages with pretty background music and not much else to look at. That's not a bad title for this movie actually. Star Trek, Space for Ages. Now after the overture finally ends, after a couple of minutes, oh also good point, 2001 also had an overture too. Just worth pointing out. But yeah, it ends and the movie finally brings us to more space. Oh, whoopie-woo. Okay, no, this is taking way too long. I'm fast forwarding. Oh, I thought that said penis clam bake. I apologise. Moving on. So the movie probably starts with a couple of Klingon ships flying into something I made in Forge of Neon when I was 15. The big blue shoots at the Klingon ships and kills everyone aboard. Then we cut to this guy, who's here for this bit and only this bit, so I'm glad we extended the runtime for this necessary bit of character building. Before we see that some politician types are seeing the Klingons dying on their readouts. We also see that no matter how futuristic you try to make your 1970s science fiction clothes look, they will always just look like they were made in the 1970s. Meanwhile, Spock is on his planet rocking some good hair as he's about to undergo a ceremony that will purge himself of all emotion once and for all. But he breaks it off when he senses shit going down in space. Now, why this particular disturbance in space disturbs him so much, I mean, whatever, let's just power through. But also the Vulcans speak that this woman's given. Yeah, she's clearly just speaking English, and they just dubbed her with herself speaking gibberish that matched the mouth movements. I mean, the languages and cultures in the Star Trek universe were clearly thought out ahead of time, and it's a masterpiece of world building that rivals Lord of the Rings. Meanwhile... I wonder who it is. Oh, it's Kirk! Kirk, now an admiral, knows the Enterprise is getting put back to work for a mission to investigate the Big Blue, and he demands that he be on the ship when that happens. Because even though he's moved on with his life, he'd much rather go back to what makes him feel like he's still in his 30s, and in his prime. I feel like this movie say a lot about where the cast was at this point in their lives.
Following that meeting, report to me in 1 hour.
What the hell? Kirk arrives on the Starship dock and meets up with Scotty, but more importantly, what happened to the uniforms? Seriously, look back at the show. Yeah, you can say it's campy and it's way too vibrant, it's like some gaudy hippie stuff, but this is just dull. And kind of sickly. Dull beige and beigey blue as a universal palette is just not fun to look at. And the whole movie is this. Give me the bright, colourful uniforms and sets. I mean, you can fix it up a bit because you have a budget now, but why suck the colour out in such an unflattering way? Shatner and Scotty take a small pod to, Kirk and Scotty take a small pod to the Enterprise, and this scene... Yeah, okay, this scene goes on for way too long, and everyone's made this point already. This is probably the scene everyone refers to when they talk about this movie being way too slow and boring, and yeah, I definitely agree, this is overkill. I assume this is the director's decision. I mean, he had clout. It was Robert Wise. He was an accomplished director by this point. It's not like someone like a Brett Ratner, where he just looks at the studio notes and checks them all off one by one and doesn't try to have a voice of his own with his direction. Might as well talk about the direction while I'm at it. We'll have time. See, with all this trying to replicate 2001 shit, I feel that Robert Wise, who's famed for making movies like West Side Story, The Sound of Music, The Haunting, etc., just had no idea what to do with the material. Now this has happened before and it's happening now still. Look at some superhero movies, namely Hulk and Thor. Both made by more artsier, drama-heavy filmmakers who weren't all too comfortable with the genre they had been handled with, so they just overcompensated with the visuals. Remember the scene transitions in Hulk that looked like an episode of 24 and the Dutch angles in Thor? With this first Star Trek movie, it's pretty much the same. Oh, well, Jesus, I don't know how the hell to do a sci-fi thing. 2001's all slow and epic, right? I'll do everything slow and epic. And this is how we end up with the mess they're in right now, because this scene is still going! Oh my god! So Shatner gets on the ship, Kirk gets on the ship, and it's full of new young blood trying to figure out how everything fits and how everything works. Kirk roams around for a bit, and he finally meets the new captain, who's played by the dad from Seventh Heaven. Well, Seventh Heaven and other things.
Mourning the scandal surrounding actor Stephen Collins.
It's uglier by the day.
I know there's no greater feeling than the love of family. Where can you go?
In 1973, there were 2 occasions when I exposed myself to this young woman.
One place that you'll find Seventh Heaven.
When you exposed yourself to his 10-year-old sister, did you have an erection?
No. I mean, no. Partial?
Partial erection?
Maybe, yes.
Seventh Heaven.
Something unthinkably wrong has happened.
So Shatner and Kirk and Scotty find out that a couple of randoms are getting teleported onto the Enterprise. Now, it doesn't work out due to technical difficulties, again to set up that the ship's not what it once was, and they end up getting turned inside out or something, like in The Fly. Now, this scene has nothing to do with any other scene. After that, we pretty much resume the scene we were just in. Kirk and Collins, Shatner and Collins, I'm just calling Collins, you can live with that. Kirk assumes captain duties of the Enterprise from Collins, who's understandably mad, but yeah, this scene could have just been one conversation. But instead it was interrupted by an entire other scene that didn't tie into anything. In fact, the only thing that seems to justify this whole vignette is this part.
Gentlemen, turbo shaft 8.
Back that way, sir.
Where Kirk, fuck it, asks for directions from this woman, to show that he's sort of a stranger in this familiar territory, and that he may not be fully prepared to take back captain duties. Like, Kirk's trip through the ship so far was mainly walking through areas he either knew or he didn't have that much of a destination anyway, so he didn't care where he was going, but the script asked for a bit where Kirk gets lost for that little bit of character moment. So the only way to have 3 seconds of dialogue to set that up was if Kirk got sidetracked by something, which meant he needed to get urgently sidetracked apparently, which meant that there needed to be a brief disaster that didn't affect the rest of the movie, because that would be a completely different plot. Or, you know, just find some much easier way of doing that. 5 minutes of all that. So a senile old man walks down a hallway, then gets lost like the doddering old coot that he is, and has to be assisted by the new generation that has their shit together. Let Father Camden take control, you idiot. So he might molest 1 or 2 of the kids on the ship. Who's gonna know? In space, no one can hear you scream. The blueness does more damage, and the Enterprise is gonna go out there and explore shit. Then Bones, their doctor, beams aboard, looking like this, for some reason. But not after we get a new cast member.
The navigator, Lieutenant Ilea.
Penis clampback herself. Yeah, I was expecting a man too. Ilea here is an old flame of Decker. Stephen Collins' character is named Decker, but I'll probably just call him Collins, you can put up with that. That or El Pedo. With a good doctor aboard, the Enterprise finally sets out at roughly 35 minutes into this 130-minute long movie. However, one thing worth noting here is the music. Now, this is one of those rare movies that barely exists anymore, where the music is forefront in the film's audio and is trying to be memorable. I've already talked about the blandness of the movie's colour scheme, but camera-wise, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good-looking movie, except for one thing, which would be fine if they didn't do it to a distractingly large degree, and that is the split-focus shot. Camera lenses are made to have a certain part of what you're seeing clear and other stuff blurry depending on how far away it is. But split focus is when the shot is literally one side of the screen focusing on something different than what the other half is focusing on. You'll see one thing in the background really clearly on the left side, and the right side, the thing right up to the camera is clear. which you can't get with a normal lens. Robert Wise uses a split focus shot over 30 times in this movie alone. And here's all of them. So Collins and Aaliyah discuss their previous failed shot at trying to be together.
About as difficult as if I had seen you again. Would you have been able to say it?
No.
Something unthinkably wrong had just happened.
Why do we need this? The Star Trek main cast is like 7 people. Why not just write a story for one of those ones? One of the ones on the show that never got focused on in any episode. We could get Chekhov a girlfriend. Or Hua can have something going on. But not that. Instead we get a B story about these 2 brand new characters we've never seen before, while a handful of pre-established people are just as unutilized as they've ever been. I know the show and the movies were mostly about Kirk, Spock and Bones, but if you want to have a feature film with more character, why take character away from ones that the audience might actually want to see? So Spock shows up 48 minutes into the movie, like when Thor arrived late in the Avengers. Only in the Avengers, you're supposed to be like, yay, Thor, he's finally here, the team is complete. Whereas with here, it's... That is so... whatever. But we do get to hear Shatner say Spock repeatedly. That's always funny.
Spock.
The Enterprise encounters the anomaly, where Spock sends the anomaly a response asking not to be killed. The laser blast shoots out, vanishes into nothing. But from the Enterprise crew's point of view, why did they think that would happen? Like, if someone fires a missile at a country and the victim country quickly surrenders to the guys that fired the missile and make peace, that hasn't cancelled out that there's a missile heading towards them. Why did Kirk think that they would be fine if Spock just worked his magic quick as he could? It's not like these laser blasts are normal in this future and people know how they work. No one's seen this big blue thing before. After they've asked the anomaly to allow them to fly right into it, then we get the real 2001 stuff. And this stuff goes on for a full 5 minutes or so as well. Just in case you thought they'd ease up on you a bit. But luckily, after that scene, we get a totally different scene of them flying through the anomaly slowly for a few minutes. But then, just when all hope seems lost, something actually happens in the movie. The anomaly, now believed to be some sort of huge ship for a much more evolved race inside of it, sends in some sort of organic, electrical thing which does very little until it suddenly kills Aaliyah. Stakes are raised, so apparently she wasn't that important. Or she was extremely important. The anomaly assimilates her into itself and sends her back, but now sort of like a android, I suppose. No longer a living thing, just being used by the anomaly to speak through it, to communicate with the Enterprise's crew and work out what's going on. The probe tries to figure out what makes the humans tick, so we can assimilate the whole crew to make itself smarter. Collins tries to see if he can buy them some time, teach the probe more about humanity, and hopefully bring out any Aaliyah that still lives in the probe. Dare I say, expose it? There. One test he tries to break through the probe's inner emotions is this game that they play, and Ialea was apparently very good at it. Your guess is as good as mine at this point. Meanwhile, Spock himself is so curious about the anomaly, he sneaks away to go off on his own into the anomaly's core. However, the way they shot the sneaking around scene looks a bit... logical.
I have successfully penetrated the next chamber of the alien's interior. I have penetrated.
Spock mind melds with the anomaly's brain, and it goes incredibly not well, so good job on the logical thinking there, dude. Spock tells Kirk that he's learned that V'Ger, the anomaly identifies itself as V'Ger, like I said, sexual overtones, is just one enormous computer that doesn't understand organic life and is having an existential crisis, desperate to know where it came from. It's looking for some sort of computer god and wishes to kill any non-machine life forms who aren't in the creator's image and hopefully go on to merge with its creator. Kirk and Spock lie to the probe and say they know who V'Ger's god is, but they say they won't tell the Ialea probe, only V'Ger's core directly, where Kirk hopes that he can secretly shut V'Ger down. Shatner, Spock, Bones, Collins and the Ialea probe go down to V'Ger's core, where they learn that V'Ger is actually the old Voyager NASA satellite, which apparently went through a black hole and ended up being pimped out by a planet of machine life forms. Now, there's no official statement that this planet of machine life forms wasn't Cybertron, so that's what I'm going to assume it is. Now, V'Ger does not take kindly to learning that its maker was just a bunch of filthy, stinking humans and lab coats. And so, in a tantrum, it threatens to destroy the Earth. But the crew was saved at the last second by...
What that'll do to you?
El Pedo. Collins decides to merge with V'Ger to stave off the attack on Earth, and also to merge with what's left of Ialea, so they can finally be together. Yay, I suppose. And Kirk decides to keep all of this a complete secret from the government for some fucking reason, and they fly away into the credits. So, I actually kind of like this movie. It's slow as absolute hell, it's not a thing like the tone of the original show, and it's overcompensating to not be schlock. Comes across as it being 2 feet up its own ass, but man, as a Star Trek story, it works solidly. It feels like it would completely fit in as an original Star Trek episode. In fact, it was an original Star Trek episode, sorta. And while that episode works a bit better because of its tightness, this one has a nice scope to it. But yeah, if you're not well acquainted with the Star Trek franchise and you're just curious and watching some sci-fi movie, probably skip this first one. It's methodical to the teeth, so it'll probably bore most people. Now, if you just want a smart but fun sci-fi film, well, to be continued.